This is the tragic family behind the Ebony Magazine's 500 million empires, and their story is more heartbreaking than you can imagine. At the forefront is John Harold Johnson. This man built the most powerful black media empire in American history with just a $500 loan from his mother. The president called him by his first name. Martin Luther King trusted him with stories no other publisher could touch. Forbes has listed him on their richest lists many times. For half a century, the Johnson family's wealth seemed immeasurable. But behind every achievement was a family quietly falling apart, and today, they are left with nothing. What happened to the Johnson family? This is the story the magazine never printed about itself. Born from nothing. With a long and tumultuous life ahead, John Harold Johnson was born on January 19, 1918, in Arkansas City. His mother, Gertrude, worked as a cook for a levee camp along the Mississippi River, supporting her husband and keeping the family fed. His father, Leroy, struggled to provide, working at a sawmill for wages that barely covered the week. They lived in a tin-roofed house near the river, in a town where black families had been living the same hard, narrow life for generations. John was a third-generation descendant of slaves. That fact was not ancient history when he was born. It was his grandfather's life, and the effects were still fresh. While the family struggled to make ends meet, John's father passed away in an accident at the sawmill. This happened in 1926, and John was 8 years old. Yet it would not be the last thing the Mississippi Delta would take from him. Life as a widow showed John's mother that this town had nothing to offer any of them, as just a year after tragedy struck the family, the Mississippi River flooded. This great Mississippi flood tore through Arkansas City and left John's family homeless for 6 weeks. They lived on the levee with hundreds of other families from different backgrounds and ethnicities. His mother remarried a man named James Williams, who helped keep the household going. But the town itself had nothing more to give. Social discrimination was still the norm in many places, as when John finished 8th grade, Gertrude discovered there was no high school in Arkansas City for black students. Rather than let her son's education simply end at 13, John went back and repeated the 8th grade, sitting in the same classroom for another year while his mother worked and saved and planned. She saved money for 2 years so they could leave that town, and in the summer of 1933, when John was 15 years old, Gertrude packed them up and bought 2 train tickets to Chicago. They arrived during the World's Fair, walked into a city and decided to stay. Her second husband would join them soon, but Chicago was a different world entirely, and they would learn that the hard way. In the meantime, it felt new for John to see many black doctors walking to their offices, black lawyers arguing cases, and black business owners opening their own doors in the morning. He had grown up in a place where none of that existed, and now he was standing in a city full of people who had refused that ceiling altogether. With that settled, he enrolled at DuSable High School on the South Side, and he did not blend in quietly. He stood out almost immediately, excelled in his studies, and became class president before rising to student council president. Then he became editor of the school newspaper and business manager of the yearbook. His classmates in those halls would be well-known figures, including Nat King Cole and Red Fox, 2 names that would later mean something to many people. On the night of his graduation, a teacher pulled him aside and told him that Johnny Johnson was not a good enough name for the man he was becoming. So that very night he chose the middle name Harold for himself and walked across the stage as John Harold Johnson for the first time. After graduation, he landed a job as an office clerk at Supreme Life Insurance Company, one of the few African-American businesses in Chicago large enough to have real influence within and beyond the community. He took the odd approach, working by day and going to school by night to attend the University of Chicago. It was during his time at school that he met his close friend and future wife Eunice Walker, who also worked alongside him at Supreme Life. His specific task at that company was to go through black newspapers from across the country every single week and summarize the most important stories for the company president. Week after week, story after story, he became one of the most informed people in black Chicago without anyone around him fully realizing it. And that was when the big idea arrived. If he was this hungry for an official source of black news, black culture, and black achievement, then thousands of other people had to be feeling the same way. Except nobody was doing that. At least for now. Reader's Digest had built an empire giving mainstream America a summary of the world. There was no version of that for Black America. So he decided he would build it, but the banks had other ideas. He walked into institution after institution across Chicago, laid out his plan, and was turned away every single time. It was a great pitch, and he had no bad track record, collateral, or loan that ruined his credibility. Yet nobody was willing to help him. Looking back later on, he admitted he should have understood why. He was a young Black man in 1942 asking white-owned banks to bet on a magazine for Black readers. And worse yet, he was doing it at a time when it wasn't practical, even for those interested, to take such a risk, especially when World War II was still in full swing. With nobody willing to listen to or negotiate with John, he went home to his mother. But once his mother Gertrude understood, she did not hesitate. She put her furniture up as collateral and walked into Citizens Loan Corporation and borrowed $500 to buy postage stamps. John went back to Supreme Life, where he had spent years reading endless mailing lists of 20,000 Black insurance policyholders, and he sent every single name on that list a letter. The letter asked everyone interested in a $2 prepaid subscription to a magazine that did not yet exist. He had no finished product to show them, not even a sample issue, and to his surprise, 3,000 people sent money. In June 1942, the first issue of Negro Digest came off the press. It sold every copy it printed. Within 12 months, it was moving 50,000 copies every single month across the country. John Johnson was 24 years old and had just proven something that Madison Avenue and every bank that had turned him away had refused to believe. Black America was a massive and loyal audience. He had started with his mother's furniture and $500 he did not own, and within just 3 years he would launch Ebony Magazine and change American media forever. His face would appear on the Forbes 400. Presidents would call him by his first name. Martin Luther King would trust him with stories that no other publisher could touch. By late September 1945, Negro Digest was making lots of money. But John Johnson was not the kind of man who stopped at having enough. He wanted something bigger. Something that would sit on every Black family's coffee table in America the way Life magazine sat on others. He wanted a magazine that showed Black people at their best, from their weddings and their businesses to their celebrations and happy faces. His wife Eunice came up with the name, Ebony. What happened next would change America's mainstream media forever. On November 1, 1945, the first issue of Ebony Magazine hit newsstands across the small region. The first entire print run of 25,000 copies sold out completely. Johnson printed more, and then more. And within a few years, Ebony had a circulation of over 1 million copies a month and was the most widely read Black publication in the history of the United States. Yet their lives would only get more difficult from this point, repeatedly marked by loss, depression, and sickness, even in the midst of generous wealth. Personal struggles, difficulties, and tragedies. Shortly after Ebony Magazine kicked off, John's wife Eunice became secretary-treasurer of Johnson Publishing and started writing editorials for the magazine. But her biggest contribution started in 1958, when a friend asked her to help put together a charity fashion show for a hospital in New Orleans. That one-time favor became an idea that would bloom into the Ebony Fashion Fair. The idea was to start a traveling fashion show that would eventually visit 190 cities a year across the United States, Canada, and the Caribbean. Later on, this would turn from a business into a charity, raising over $55 million for poor families and struggling schools, including the United Negro College Fund and sickle cell anemia research. To stock the show with the latest brands and fashion products, Eunice flew to Paris every single season to buy clothes directly from the top fashion houses. These included heavy hitters for the time like Dior, Valentino, Yves Saint Laurent, and Bob Mackie. But there was a huge problem on the horizon. Most of those design houses refused to loan their clothes to an African American the way they loaned them to everyone else. So Eunice bought them outright every season, spending as much as $1.5 million a year of her own money on couture just to make sure the Passion Charity Project worked in the long run. Over the course of the fashion fair's history, she personally acquired over 8,000 designer ensembles. This achievement made her one of the top successful buyers of haute couture in all of America. Yet most of the fashion world had no idea who she was. She ran that show for 5 decades without a single mainstream headline about herself. The burnout from this alone felt excruciating. And on top of the constant stress she had to deal with, Eunice and her husband John had a private problem that none of their wealth or influence could solve. They could not have children. After years of trying, they went through painful fertility tests at the Mayo Clinic. The results came back normal for both of them, and doctors had no explanation. After 24 years of staying married, they had built a publishing empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and a magazine that had given Black America its own mirror, and the Johnsons had no heir and no answer as to why. Whether it was due to reasons that could be explained by modern medicine or some physical complications yet to be fully explored is still up in the air. Either way, they wanted to have a child. So in June 1965, they adopted a newborn boy and named him John Harold Johnson. So after much thinking and deliberation, they decided to adopt. And that's what happened in June 1965 when they brought a newborn boy and named him after his new father. 2 years later, they adopted a newborn girl and named her Linda. John started coming home for dinner every single night, making massive shifts at work just to make time for family. Those close to the family said he even kept Sundays entirely free just to be with his new children. It seemed the man, once hungry for ambition and recognition, had suddenly found something he truly wanted more than the empire. And then the sickness started. To the family's horror, John Jr. started having long and painful episodes that no one could explain at first. When the diagnosis finally came back, it was sickle cell anemia, a disease that painfully deformed and damaged internal organs over time. It didn't help that this happened during the 60s, a time when this medical issue had nothing close to a cure or real treatment. The adoption agency had forgotten to screen him, and there was nothing John could do. With great difficulty, he had to watch his son grow up in agony while knowing how the story was going to end. Even with this issue, John Jr. made it to adulthood working as a staff photographer for Ebony and Jet. He loved motor racing and was described by everyone who knew him as a daredevil, willing to do anything his body allowed. He attended the University of Chicago Laboratory School and Harvard St. George School in Chicago. Now in his mid-20s, and at the peak of physical ailments and painful episodes, his parents already had their expectations set, but nothing could prepare them enough for the tragedies about to strike. On a Sunday in December 1981, John Harold Johnson Jr. passed away at the University of Chicago's Weiler Hospital. He was 25 years old. After a few days of mourning, John went back to the office the following week. He kept his son's office on the floor of Johnson Publishing exactly as it was and did not allow anyone to touch it. He did the same thing with the childhood bedroom, leaving it exactly as it had been on the day he died, and they would leave it that way for the rest of their lives. By 1982, barely a year afterwards, Johnson Publishing crossed $100 million in annual revenue for the first time. The empire kept growing and the covers kept coming. He was recognized by many people and appreciated within and beyond the Black community. Then 23 years later, on August 8, 2005, John Johnson died of heart failure in Chicago. He was 87 years old when he passed away, and his final years were spent watching the mainstream media built by his magazines move on without him. As we'll see, slowly but surely, his massive business was collapsing, about to be gone forever. The betrayal and fall of the family business. From as far back as the early 90s, print advertising as a business was shrinking, and the internet was pulling readers away from newspapers and magazines. Ebony Magazine had reached its peak at that time, and now the cracks were starting to show. In 2002, just 3 years before he passed away, John had handed the CEO title to his daughter Linda Johnson, but he stayed on as publisher and honorary chairman until the very end. He was unable to let go of the thing he had built, even at the cost of his health. 5 years later, on January 3, 2010, his wife died as well at her home. She was 93 years old and was buried beside her husband at Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago, in a private family mausoleum. The cause was renal failure, and what the couple left behind was a crumbling business empire her daughter could barely keep on its feet. The company was heavily in debt, so much so that she considered selling the old building on Michigan Avenue that her father had built as a monument to the business. But things were about to get much worse. 2008 came with a national recession that tore through the publishing industry. Even with many loyal readers keeping things afloat the old-fashioned way, print advertising collapsed across the board. Ebony's monthly circulation, which had reached 2.3 million copies at its peak, fell steadily with no floor in sight. Later in 2010, Linda had no choice but to sell the Johnson Publishing headquarters at 820 South Michigan Avenue. It was a historical monument, one of the few downtown Chicago buildings ever designed and owned by a black company at the time of its construction. She sold it for $8 million, and the buyers quickly repurposed it into a large set of home apartments. Seeing no better option than to adapt to current times, the magazine gave up on the one thing that kept it special through the 90s and the early 2000s. It ended its print edition entirely and went digital only. But even that wasn't enough to keep things afloat, and debts only continued to rise. In 2016, the losses had grown so severe that Linda sold both Ebony and Jet to Clearview Group, a private equity firm based in Texas. After 71 years of publications, Johnson's name was no longer on the masthead of the magazines John had built. Worse yet, the freelance writers who had worked for the new owners went unpaid for months and eventually filed a lawsuit, which was settled with an $80,000 payment split between 45 writers and editors. Things for the company went from bad to horrific in April 2019. Johnson Publishing Company filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in federal court in Chicago. The filing listed between 299 creditors and investors plus an estimated total debt of over $36 million. Many efforts were made to gather the scraps of what remained of the company. One idea was the archive, a collection of over 4 million photos taken by Johnson Publishing photographers across 8 decades of the business. It was showcased and sold off in July 2019. The winning bid was $30 million, paid by a group of foundations including the Getty Trust, the Ford Foundation, and the MacArthur Foundation. The photographs went to the Getty Research Institute and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Still, there seemed to be some hope on the horizon. This hope came to light in 2020, when both companies got much-needed attention from someone unexpected. It was former NBA player Junior Bridgman, and he bought Ebony and Jet for $14 million as a gift for his daughter. Thanks to this, Ebony exists today as a digital-only publication, and the Johnson family has no ownership stake in it as of the making of this video. Fashion Fair Cosmetics, the line Eunice had built from scratch in 1973 into a brand sold in OC 500 department stores, filed for its own bankruptcy in 2019. It was bought out by a group of investors. One of them was Desiree Rogers, a former Johnson Publishing CEO. She promised Linda and her daughter Alexa that she would not try to buy their family's businesses and allow them to pass. By implication, Desiree Rogers broke this promise to Linda's daughter and John Johnson's only grandchild. Linda and Alexa later described this act as the biggest devastation and betrayal they'd ever felt. Now, the Johnson Publishing headquarters, the Fashion Fair brand, and Ebony and Jet publications were all gone. Now, with both companies in her power, Desiree Rogers relaunched Fashion Fair in late September 2021 through Sephora. And despite the implied betrayal, what she did with them turned out far more successful than anything Eunice and Linda Johnson had ever accomplished. The entire product line had now been rebuilt from scratch with new formulas, new packaging, and new products. The original pink tubes and compact cases that Eunice Johnson had designed were gone. In their place came white and gold packaging with modernized vegan supplements that included vitamin C, vitamin E, turmeric, bamboo powder, and green tea extract. By the time Fashion Fair expanded into Macy's, it was stocked in over 320 Sephora locations and almost 100 Macy's stores across the country. Rogers also owned Black Opal, a mass-market cosmetics line for women of color that they had purchased in 2019 and relaunched through Ulta Beauty, giving them a presence across 2 separate price points in the black beauty market simultaneously. In 2024, Fashion Fair and Black Opal were named the official beauty sponsors of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, the same city where John and Eunice Johnson had built their empire, and the same city where Eunice is buried. Rogers and her team provided beauty services to attendees at the convention, which that year centered on Vice President Kamala Harris's presidential campaign. Everything John Johnson built had now been sold off and repurposed piece by piece in just 15 years. John Harold Johnson had started with $500 borrowed against his mother's furniture in 1942. At its peak, the empire he built employed almost 2,000 people, brought in hundreds of millions each year, and sat inside a building he owned on one of the most famous streets in Chicago. He had put the face of Black America on newsstands in every corner of the country for 60 years. By 2019, there was nothing left to liquidate. The empire had fallen, and the family was left with nothing. Now, let's discuss in the comments below. Are there any better steps you think Linda could have taken to prevent this collapse, or could the fault be traced all the way back to wrong decisions made by John Johnson at his prime? We'd love to hear your thoughts as well. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now, click on the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it. Take care.